What is one of the most common mistakes you see when you're analyzing entrepreneurial firms in terms of financing? What are some mistakes that entrepreneurs make and things that other entrepreneurs could avoid doing?
Well, a very common mistake is to go seek financing when you don't have an idea that's well fleshed out. So you end up learning about your business plan from someone who could have been a key funding source, but no longer will be because they see that you have this half-baked plan and they don't want to participate. So sort of the premature access to sophisticated capital is a common mistake that people make.
How important is it, do you think, for the entrepreneur to choose a specific type of investor to invest in their business?
I think that's probably the most important decision that they can make. I think oftentimes the first order question that the entrepreneur has to answer is not how much money do I need, but who should I get money from? And if I were trading off getting an extra dollar versus getting fewer dollars but from a better source of funding, I would definitely go down the latter road.
I thought it was interesting you mentioned optimism. How do you feel optimism plays into entrepreneurship? And I think the big question is, can somebody who's not that optimistic still succeed in an entrepreneurial venture?
So that's a good question. It's hard to know exactly what optimism is doing. We know when we look at the data that entrepreneurs tend to be very optimistic people relative to other people. And that can kind of cut both ways. On the one hand, that can empower you to face an uncertain future and just kind of keep your head down and keep pushing even when it seems like the odds are against you. And that can be really positive. On the other hand, it can be negative if you think that if you have wildly inaccurate beliefs about your own ability to succeed and you end up taking foolish risks and doing things imprudently, then that can be a negative. So
you mentioned that optimism is one of those characteristics that you find in an entrepreneurial person. What are some other characteristics that you find doing research about a successful entrepreneur versus someone who's not?
Well, so I've done some work with Manju Puri where we've looked at the attitudes of entrepreneurs, and what we've tried to do is compare entrepreneurs to people who were sort of demographically similar to entrepreneurs, but for a variety of reasons had chosen not to become entrepreneurs. And you definitely see that entrepreneurs, they are more optimistic than other people. They are also, they have a better appetite for risk. They're willing to take more substantial risks than other people. And then another thing that seems to be really important is they derive substantial satisfaction from the autonomy of being self-employed. That seems to be a very important component. So one of the things you can do is you can look at how the people got to be entrepreneurs. Some people are self-employed because they inherited a business from a family member who's deceased or retired. Other people have gone out and started a business from scratch, or bought a business from someone else that they wanted to run. And as you can imagine, those people have, in many respects, they have different psychological traits. The person that's going out and starting the business or buying the business it has more of an appetite for risk, tends to be more optimistic. But pretty much across the board, you see, no matter how you got to be where you are as an entrepreneur, you see that there is a substantial appreciation for the autonomy that comes from self-employment.
You mentioned risk, or tolerance for risk is an important factor. Do you feel like that's something that people can change? If you're out there and you're not very risk tolerant, is that something that through research or through learning you can change your
I definitely
approach?
think so. Yeah, I definitely do, because a lot of how you appreciate risk is just how you frame problems. And if you go through if you go through some sort of training where you're taught to think systematically about uncertain situations, then you're going to think differently about the risk than if the risk just hits you and you react with a gut reaction. And so I think there's no question that someone who is trained to use parts of their brain that don't necessarily come into play just from a gut reaction, I think they will behave differently towards risk, and I think they'll take more risk and they'll take it more prudently.
One thing that we like to ask all of our interviews for the newsletter is, do you think entrepreneurs are born, and do you think they can be made?
that is an interesting question. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be teaching entrepreneurial finance if I didn't think there was some element of making an entrepreneur. And but there's some interesting research out there that suggests that there's a very large genetic component to it. So there's two kinds of twins. You can be an identical twin or a fraternal twin. Well, so what you can do, there's an interesting study you can run where you can compare the coincidence rate of entrepreneurship in identical twins to the coincidence rate in fraternal twins. And if you think about what you're doing, your question really gets to this sort of nature versus nurture idea.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, you're kind of holding nurture constant by comparing twins, because in both cases they grew up in the same family together. They had the same family conditions, the same upbringing, blah blah blah. The only difference is, in one case you're an exact genetic copy of the other person, whereas in the other case you're only sort of half a genetic copy. So you can really measure how much does genetic difference impact entrepreneurship. A very cool idea. And the research that I've seen in this area suggests that the rates of entrepreneurship, the coincidence rate, so in other words, if one person's an entrepreneur, is the other person also an entrepreneur? And those rates are much higher among identical twins than among fraternal twins. So what that tells you is that undoubtedly there is just some sort of latent component to this. But that's only a partial answer to your question, because that really just says, are some people naturally better at it than others? And the answer seems to be yeah. The real question is, what's the payoff? We could take somebody who's got a lot of natural ability and we could train them and make them really good. Or we could take somebody who has very little natural ability and train them and turn them into an entrepreneur. I think very few people would say that you can't improve entrepreneurship outcomes by training people well. But the real question is, how do you allocate resources in the most efficient way? Are you best off taking somebody who has a lot of natural skill and giving them the very best training, and then you really get a huge outcome? Or is it sort of remedial training? You see what I mean? Or you take somebody who wants to do it but just really doesn't have the best skills, and you train them into being a success. I think, in my view, you're better off taking the people with a high latent ability and giving them the best possible training. These two things are complements.
And sort of our final question is, if you have one piece of advice to give our budding entrepreneurs out there, what would it be?
Be optimistic, but don't be too optimistic.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah.